When Lucien chased after his white moonlight abroad, I begged him not to leave, but he didn't even look back. A year later, I got married, and Lucien flew back. Seeing my wedding ring, the usually arrogant Lucien broke down. He forced a smile and said, "Rose, did you take it off yourself, or do you want me to take it off for you?" His voice was trembling. "If you want a ring, I'll buy you one. Just throw this one away, please." I had a small wedding, only inviting a dozen or so close friends and family for a meal. My husband pampered me. He made sure I didn't have to lift a finger. He entertained the guests while I sat chatting with my best friend. Nellie, my best friend, was deeply moved when she saw me get married. She sighed, "I thought you'd wait for Lucien your whole life." I smiled and lowered my head. "I thought so too." She asked, "Does Lucien know you're married?" I shook my head. "He doesn't know. There's no need for him to know." She paused, then said, "I heard Lucien went crazy last night, booking a flight to come back overnight." I didn't respond. He must have been in such a rush, because his white moonlight ran away again. Just like before, when she got angry with Lucien, she ran abroad. Lucien booked a flight right in front of me, planning to go after her. I was on my period, wrapped in blankets, feeling cold all over. Shivering, I sat across from him, watching as his long fingers quickly tapped on his phone and booked a flight for that night. I gritted my teeth and still tried to persuade him, "Lucien, can you not go?" Lucien looked at me with his dark, clear eyes, and smiled casually. "You stay at home like a good girl. I'll bring you back a gift." He lifted my chin, softly kissed my lips, then wrapped me up in the blanket. "Do you want a necklace or a bracelet?" I didn't say anything. Lucien liked to give jewelry as gifts. He had given me many pieces, but never a ring. He didn't give Marina many gifts, but every time, it was always a ring. I took a deep breath, looking at his handsome, slim face, his fair skin, and still, I wanted to stop him. "Really, can't you stay?" Lucien's smile faded slightly. He patted my head. "You know what our relationship is." I froze in place, unable to respond. Lucien was the one I pursued back then. He had one condition: our relationship could never be made public, especially not in front of Marina. To put it bluntly, I was just a backup. I had no right to stop him. Even though we had been living together and he had taken me to family gatherings. When Lucien saw I had no more words, he smiled and kissed my forehead. "Be good, I'll bring you a gift." I lowered my head. "When will you be back?" He stood up and slowly buttoned his shirt. "A few days." At the time, he probably didn't expect that his white moonlight wasn't just going abroad for a vacation, but for study abroad, which meant he ended up staying for a whole year. I watched Lucien leave, his tall, straight back as he walked away, and sighed. As if sensing my unhappiness, Lucien turned around. "Before I go abroad, think about what you want me to do." "I'll do anything for you." I looked at his face, thought for a moment, and said, "Can you help me look into someone, a war correspondent named Herbert?" Lucien's face darkened. "What's your relationship with him?" "If it's unclear, I won't help." I bit my lip. "He's my brother. From my aunt's side." Lucien's expression softened a little, and he nodded. "I'll let you know once I have news." He turned and walked away. I watched his back disappear, then took out a photo from my wallet. In the photo, there was a lean, handsome man who looked very similar to Lucien. I traced the photo with my fingers. Lucien really was a forgetful person. I had told him I grew up in an orphanage, there was no aunt. I also mentioned there was an older brother in the orphanage who took care of me, and we grew up together. But he heard it and forgot it all. He never suspected why I always liked looking at his face. Only loved his face. Lucien truly loved Marina. Even though Marina had been indecisive for all these years, never willing to settle down. He loved her unconditionally. And I really did love Lucien. That face of his. The face that resembled Herbert's. I had always been grateful to Lucien. He saved me from danger. When I met him, I had already lost touch with Herbert for 3 years. Everyone said Herbert was gone. I became a walking corpse, without any vitality. Then I saw Lucien, a junior by 1 year. When I saw his face, so much like Herbert's, I cried. I did everything I could to get close to Lucien, treating him well without any conditions. Everyone knew I was Lucien's shadow, carrying his bag, holding his coat, buying things, delivering messages when he and Marina argued, and helping him home when he was drunk. Maybe I was so good to him that he couldn't ignore me anymore. So, on one drunken night after an argument with Marina, he pulled me into his arms. "Do you like me?" I looked at his lean, handsome face and nodded. From that day on, I became Lucien's secret girlfriend. If being a backup could be called a girlfriend. I was with him for years. Lucien and Marina didn't end up together, but we lived together. Sometimes, Lucien would hug me and sigh, "Rose, you're the best woman for me. You don't even care about my money." I laughed. "If you want to give it to me, I wouldn't refuse." "But you don't spend my money," Lucien said, his sharp, dark eyes fixed on me. "You don't wear the jewelry I buy, and you don't force me to make our relationship public." He said, "Sometimes I even feel like you're treating me as a backup too." I tapped his nose, laughing as I buried my face in his chest. Whether I was a backup or not didn't matter. We'd been through 6 years together. Those 6 years meant a lot to me. But Lucien didn't think so. He still loved Marina so much. If Marina called him in the middle of the night, drunk, Lucien would immediately get dressed and go to pick her up. Before, Lucien would just leave without explaining anything. But later, he started explaining himself, his face betraying a hint of guilt. I thought that meant something had changed for me in his heart. But I was wrong. He still chased after Marina abroad, not giving me any chance to keep him. And he was gone for a year. Lucien actually came back once during that time. He was drunk and asked me to pick him up. When I arrived at the nightclub, he was sitting in a private room, video calling Marina. When he saw me, he waved, "Rose, come here." He made me appear on camera for Marina. "Let me introduce you. This is my girlfriend of 6 years, Rose." Marina remained indifferent. But she glanced at me, her eyes lingering on my face for a few seconds. Then she smiled. "Lucien, have you changed your mind?" Lucien smiled too. "Yeah. I'm leaving my gentle, virtuous wife behind. Why would I keep sticking to you, getting cold shoulders?" Marina asked how long we had been together. I answered honestly, 6 years. Marina ended the video call. The always proud Marina didn't even say goodbye. Lucien wrapped his arm around me, but then froze. That night, Lucien had been holding me as we slept. In the middle of the night, he got a call, and when he came back, he held me, kissing me non-stop, not sleeping all night, just staring at me. By morning, his voice was hoarse. "Rose, we've come to the end." I didn't sleep either. I had already guessed. I had heard Lucien take that call. Marina casually asked him to break up with me, and promised that if he did, she would immediately get back together with him. I knew I wasn't as important to Lucien as Marina was. I nodded, not wanting things to get ugly. I turned away and wiped my eyes. Lucien held me from behind, tight enough that I could barely breathe. He whispered in my ear, "Your aunt's son. I have news. He didn't die. He's just lost his memory and is abroad." I froze all over. I turned around. "Can you bring him back?" Lucien kissed my lips one last time. "I can. It's what I owe you." The next day, he flew off to be with Marina. And then, a few days later, I saw Herbert. He was being treated by the best doctors at the best hospital in the country. His memory came back quickly, and he remembered me. Herbert had been injured and lost his memory while saving a child in a bombed area. After I woke up, the first thing he did was hug me. His gentle voice echoed in my ear, "These 10 years that I've been gone, I'm sorry you had to suffer." Tears immediately welled up in my eyes. My heart, so empty before, quietly filled up at this moment. Herbert and I had missed each other for 10 years, and neither of us wanted to waste another decade. We quickly got engaged. Herbert also asked me if I had fallen in love with someone else during those 10 years. Even if I had, he told me not to make any hasty decisions that I might regret. Lucien's face flashed vaguely in my mind. But it disappeared just as quickly. I shook my head and smiled, saying I hadn't. I traced the scar on Herbert's body, the one he got while rescuing children in a war zone, and repeated, "I haven't." Before Herbert asked, I had dreamed several times, and in every dream, Lucien appeared. In my dreams, Lucien would look at me with a mocking smile, telling me not to get the wrong idea. It still left a sour feeling in my heart. But time passed, and I stopped dreaming of Lucien. Those 6 years seemed to have blown away like the wind. Sometimes, my best friend Nellie would ask if I ever thought about Lucien. I'd stay silent for a few seconds, then shake my head. I hope he and Marina are doing well together, I said. It's best if we both forget each other. At least, I had truly left him behind, forgotten in my mind. But a few days later, while Herbert and I were having dinner, we ran into one of Lucien's classmates. He came over from a distance to greet me. "You're back in the country and didn't contact me." He walked a few steps, then stopped, staring at Herbert in shock. Herbert and Lucien looked alike, but Herbert had a scar on his forehead from the war zone. Their temperaments were completely different. Herbert didn't have that carefree, spoiled air that Lucien did. Instead, he was calm and steady. The classmate stared at Herbert, then turned back to me with a confused expression. "Rose, this." He paused, then asked, "Did you cheat on him?" I shook my head. "We broke up." The classmate looked even more surprised. "Lucien said you were still waiting obediently for him." I interrupted him. "This is my fiancé. We're getting married soon." He was stunned. He looked at the way Herbert and I were holding hands tightly, then turned and walked away in a hurry, dialing a number as he went. I raised my head to explain to Herbert, but before I could speak, he smiled and said, "It's all in the past, why bring it up?" He adjusted my hair. "I couldn't expect you to wait for me 10 years just because I disappeared for 10 years. I felt a lump in my throat, suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of grievance. The first 3 years, when I couldn't find Herbert, I clung to my phone, waiting for his call. I never turned it off, and whenever an unknown number called, my heart would race. In the first year, I kept hoping someone would call to tell me Herbert was just injured and would return soon. In the second year, I just wanted to hear someone say that Herbert was still alive. By the third year, I began to fear the phone ringing, yet I had to answer it. When Lucien showed up, I was officially diagnosed with severe anxiety and panic attacks. His face was the last straw that kept me going. Being his backup was painful, but I couldn't let go of his face. Only by looking at him did I have the strength to go on. So, did I love Lucien? I didn't know. But I was grateful to him, so much so that even though everyone mocked me for being his backup, I still accepted it. Those 6 years, to me, Lucien was a good person, someone who saved me from despair. I thought my impression of him would be good too, at least I'd be seen as understanding. But I didn't expect him to bite his teeth and call me a liar. Lucien called me late at night. I gently got out of bed, not wanting to wake Herbert. I thought he was going to take back the things he left at my place, but as soon as I picked up, he spat out 2 words with such anger that it felt like he wanted to tear me apart: "Liar." His voice was hoarse and deep. "Rose, you're a liar. You said he was your cousin's child, you lied to me." He no longer sounded like the carefree, spoiled man he used to be. He was fighting to hold back his anger, and I could even hear a trace of hurt in his voice. It was the kind of hurt a child would feel. I lowered my head and sighed. "I'm sorry." I said the apology without thinking. For the past 6 years, I'd apologized to him like this. There were many reasons. Like not staring at him in front of Marina, because it would upset her. Like not trying to hold his hand in front of Marina's friends. Like not calling him when he was having a meal with Marina. Every time, I would apologize, staring at his face, obediently saying, "I'm sorry." At first, Lucien would hesitate and pat my head like I was a child. "Next time, I'll fix it." Later, he would smile with his chin in his hand, watching me. "You're so well behaved when you apologize." Eventually, he stopped setting so many rules for me. But my instinct to apologize hadn't changed, and I blurted out, "I'm sorry." Lucien paused, then gritted his teeth. "This time, your apology doesn't count. Rose, I'm really angry. If I'd known, I would have let you stay with your man in the war zone for the rest of your life, instead of coming all the way back to put a green hat on myself." I froze. But he didn't notice. He continued asking, "Has he touched you? Rose, tell me, has he touched you?" I interrupted his anxious voice. "Lucien, stop saying that about him. He means a lot to me." There was a sudden silence on the other end. After a moment, I heard the sound of something breaking. Lucien gritted his teeth and said, one word at a time, Rose, you've never told me I was important to you. He said, remember, I never said you had to leave. You're still mine. I'm not yours. I frowned, correcting him. Since you went abroad to be with Marina, we have no relationship anymore. Lucien was silent for a while, then softly asked, so, you're getting back at me, aren't you? He seemed to become more certain. You're with him to make me jealous, right? If I gave you a chance to regret. I frowned even more. Lucien, stop this. You and Marina have finally gotten together, so just live well with her. Lucien fell silent. His breathing was deep and hurried. After a while, he didn't say anything more, and just hung up the phone. I listened to the dial tone, sighed. Lucien hadn't changed. As soon as Marina was mentioned, his rationality returned. In the past, when he was drunk, he would call me in the middle of the night, asking me to pick him up. I'd rush out in my pajamas and a coat, waiting for him at the bar entrance. In the cold weather, my hands were numb from the chill, but he refused to go back. His friends were helpless, apologizing to me before sending a video to Marina. I'll show Marina how ridiculous he looks. Lucien suddenly stood up straight, as sober as if he had never drunk. He opened the car door and sat down. His friend and I stood outside, staring at each other. His friend looked at me with embarrassment and sympathy. Sorry, I really can't do anything. Only Marina can get him to behave. I shook my head. It's okay, I don't mind. That night, I made a hangover remedy for Lucien and stayed up all night taking care of him. And he kept calling out for Marina, all night long. A voice in my head kept asking me, Rose, you really don't mind? Then why are your hands so cold? I sighed, forcing myself to pull away from the memories, not thinking about it anymore. I looked around the bedroom. The man I loved the most was here. What happened before didn't matter. The important thing was, now, I didn't mind anymore. Herbert and I started preparing for the wedding. I went to try on wedding dresses, and had to ignore several phone calls from Lucien. But the phone kept buzzing. It was all messages from Lucien. He used to never send this many messages in a month. Rose, I haven't let you go yet. Rose, you'll regret this. What are you doing? Reply. You never used to take so long to respond. The noise was unbearable. In the changing room, I grabbed my phone and quickly replied, I'm trying on wedding dresses, stop sending messages. The phone fell silent for a moment. Then it buzzed violently, non-stop, as if the person on the other end had lost their mind. I had no choice but to pick up. Lucien, if you keep acting like this, we won't even be able to stay friends. But he ignored me, bombarding me with questions instead. What's so great about him? Rose, marriage and dating are two completely different things. He took a deep breath. Rose, listen to me. Did your parents approve of your marriage? Or should I go back and talk to them? I interrupted him calmly. Lucien, stop it. It went quiet on the other end. I spoke softly, Lucien, I'm really getting married. He's someone I grew up with. We understand each other, and we're in love. Lucien was about to say something else when I cut him off. If you keep acting like this, Marina will be upset. He didn't speak, but I could hear his breath become uneven. I sighed. I told you before, I grew up in an orphanage. I don't have parents. Why do you always forget that? After I said that, I hung up. Lucien didn't call back. Meanwhile, Herbert patiently waited outside the changing room, never asking why I'd taken so long. When I came out, he held me in a long hug, reluctant to let go. Rose, thank you for loving me. I hugged him back. Thank you, too. We both grew up in orphanages, so we cherished every bit of kindness we received. Unlike Lucien, the wealthy young master who could have anything, it's understandable that he'd lose it when his obedient ex suddenly announced she was getting married. But I believe time will heal everything. In the end, he'll let go of his regrets and move on. But I overestimated Lucien's ability to accept things. A few days later, just as I was preparing for my wedding, trying to get my beauty sleep, Lucien called again in the middle of the night. He sounded like he'd been drinking. You really have guts. I was already annoyed and was considering blocking him. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse and low. Back then, why didn't I just take a look at the photo? If I had just looked at it, I would have known something was off. He was upset and angry. But I didn't look. I even pulled him out of the war zone, healed him, and brought him to you. Why did it take me this long to look at the photo? I gave my girlfriend a cheater. Lucien was so angry, his voice shaking. He lowered his voice, trying to control his emotions, but it still trembled. Rose, did you use me as a substitute? I fell silent. He fell silent too. After a while, he gritted his teeth and shouted, "Say something. Why aren't you saying anything?" But suddenly, I remembered the past. When Marina had other suitors, Lucien had posted a photo of my back on Instagram. I was wearing the latest luxury dress of the season, the one Marina wanted. That was the only time I ever wore something Lucien had bought for me. Usually, I didn't even take the tags off, just kept the clothes in the wardrobe. But that day, Lucien insisted I wear the dress, and he took a photo of me. That was the first time he posted about me on Instagram. So many people liked it, and some commented asking who I was. Lucien wrapped his arm around me to show me. With a playful tone, he said, "Babe, they're all asking who you are." When Lucien was in a good mood, he'd call me babe. He twirled my hair around his finger. "I told them you're my wife. They're so jealous." I smiled, but my eyes scanned a new comment, from Marina, "I'm going to the music festival. Want to come?" A moment later, Lucien glanced at his phone, his hand froze. He snatched the phone away, casually pulled out his credit card, and handed it to me. "Take this and buy yourself a few bags." Then he stood up, put on his coat, and prepared to leave. I watched him walk toward the door and, for some reason, I suddenly stopped him. "Lucien, don't go out, okay?" Lucien hesitated for a moment, holding the doorknob. Then he turned around and smiled at me. "Are you lonely? Then just go out for a while. Buy some clothes, buy some jewelry." He turned and closed the door, but just before it clicked shut, he said, "I'll be back soon, babe." I stared at the slowly closing door, my head lowered, feeling uncertain. At that time, we had already graduated from college and started working. Lucien had stopped calling me Rose and started calling me wife. Somewhere deep down, I did feel differently about him. I looked at the credit card on the coffee table for a long time, then put it in the drawer and never touched it again. I never thought about it again. A few days later, Lucien returned. The post with my photo on his Instagram had been deleted, though I didn't know when. A friend called to ask why he deleted the photos of his girlfriend, and he answered casually, "Oh, she's just a girl I saw on the street. She looked good, so I took a picture. I deleted it so you guys wouldn't misunderstand." At that time, I was in his arms, motionless and gentle. He hung up the phone and kissed my ear. "You're so well behaved, babe." He thought about it for a moment, then posted my picture on Instagram again, but only for himself to see. Lucien stroked my hair. "You're so beautiful, I don't want anyone else to see you." I looked at his face, smiled, and didn't speak, my heart completely still. Just like the credit card, tucked away in the drawer. At that time, I never complained, just like drinking water, I knew the warmth and coldness in my heart. But now, Lucien was full of resentment. "Rose, speak up. Am I just a substitute?" I sighed and decided to finally speak up. "What about me, Lucien? What have these 6 years been for?" Lucien stopped. I continued, "In these 6 years, I never once complained to you. Lucien, and now, just a few days of you losing it, and you can't take it?" Lucien's breathing sounded uneven. I sighed again, hung up, and blocked Lucien's messages and number. With that, I completely said goodbye to those 6 years. Herbert and I went to register our marriage and had a wedding all in one go. I carefully arranged everything, chose a wedding dress, and gave myself the fairy tale wedding I'd always dreamed of. From now on, I wouldn't be alone anymore. I had a family, and I had a home. But during the wedding, my best friend Nellie told me that Lucien had booked a ticket overnight and was rushing back like a madman. I didn't really believe it. After all, he and Marina had just gotten together, and he wouldn't be so impulsive as to leave Marina and rush back to the country. But to my surprise, he really showed up. The Lucien I remembered was tall, handsome, and exuded elegance. But the Lucian before me now was pale, haggard, and holding a jewelry box in his hand, silently watching Herbert and me. It seemed less like he was watching me, and more like he was watching Herbert. I startled him. Lucian glanced at Herbert, then at me, and beckoned with his finger. Just as Herbert went to entertain a colleague, I feared Lucian might cause trouble, so I went to find him, speaking softly and coaxingly. Please don't make a scene. This wedding means so much to me. I don't want anything to go wrong. Lucian's face darkened. Although I was pleading with him, it seemed like I had angered him instead. He looked at Herbert from a distance. Rose, who do you think we look like? I froze, not quite understanding what he meant. Lucian asked again, wife, who looks more like a substitute, me or him? He called me wife, so casually, as if we were still together. But he only ever called me wife when he was in a good mood. And his good moods were always connected to Marina. I would rather he call me Rose, with both my first and last name. I gave him a cold look. Lucian, I'm not your wife. I pointed at Herbert. I'm his wife, the legally married kind. Lucian stared at me without saying a word, his face turning dark. I immediately regretted speaking like that. He came from an aristocratic family, and having someone talk back to him like this, who knew if he'd act impulsively? I froze in place, trying to figure out how to get rid of this troublemaker, but then I heard Herbert calling me. I was filled with anxiety, though I didn't dare show it. All I could think about was Lucian's cold expression and the unpredictable future of my wedding. Herbert, as though seeing nothing amiss, pulled me into his arms and gently reassured me, don't run off. You'll get lost. He patted my shoulder. Don't be scared. I'm here. I leaned against Herbert's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. My anxiety seemed to vanish and I smiled, nodding. Herbert lowered his head and kissed my lips, a brief peck that I immediately returned, wrapping my arms around him. As long as Herbert was here, what did it matter if the wedding went smoothly or not? With Herbert by my side, I was afraid of nothing. I kissed him deeply, pouring all my feelings into it. When the kiss ended, I realized Lucian was gone. There was no scene as I had expected. He had quietly left. Nellie later said that Lucian had hurried away, looking like he was fleeing from some wild animal. Then, a message popped up on my phone from an unfamiliar number. You've never smiled at me like that. Nellie, still beside me, was gesturing with her hands. Lucian looks like he's been triggered. I've never seen him so disheveled. He even stumbled a little. What happened to him? I shook my head, not saying anything, linking my arm with Herbert's and refusing to let go. We had relied on each other when we were young, shared our hearts in adolescence, and now, we were finally together as a couple. What happened to anyone else didn't matter. What mattered was I was with the person I loved. When Lucian left, he had Nellie bring me the ring. Nellie sneered. Now he remembers to buy a ring. What was he doing before? Nellie really didn't like Lucian. She had always disapproved of me being with him, frustrated by how I couldn't see through him, but she was powerless to change it. Lucian had always been generous with me, sending necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and brooches, each different from the last. But there was never a ring. One time, during dinner, Nellie jokingly asked Lucian when he was going to give me a ring. Lucian made a phone call, and before long, a driver arrived with an emerald necklace. Nellie was so furious that her hand was shaking. I said, a ring? Rose has been with you for years, doesn't she deserve a ring? Lucian casually draped his hand over my chair, his body language oozing ownership. He leaned back nonchalantly, looking like he didn't care at all. She'll have it eventually. What are you so anxious about? He lifted my chin and smiled at me, promising, in 10 years, I'll give you a ring. I lowered my head, smiling quietly, without responding. I suddenly missed Herbert. Herbert wouldn't make promises with a flippant smile. No matter how similar their faces were, they were not the same person. After that dinner, I tried to distance myself from Lucian. I ignored his calls, didn't reply to his texts, changed my door code, and stopped visiting him. But a few days later, Lucian had a flare-up of his stomach problems and sent me a video. His face was pale and haggard. I suddenly remembered how Herbert had looked just before he went missing in the war zone. Was he also this exhausted? I couldn't control myself. Despite Nellie's disapproving glare, I still went to see Lucien. His apartment was littered with empty bottles. I didn't know how much he'd drunk while I'd been avoiding him. I sighed and began cleaning up, making porridge, washing clothes, peeling apples, taking care of him until he felt better. Lucien grabbed my hand. "Don't avoid me. Rose, I didn't lie to you. I'll buy you a ring within 10 years. He gestured, a big diamond, like this. I smiled. Then why not now? Lucien went silent. After a long pause, he said softly, right now, I have an obsession to deal with. He pulled me into his arms and held me close, his heartbeat quickening. Rose, I'm not lying. Wait for me 10 years. I looked at his face, but said nothing. Lucien pulled me even closer, like he was afraid I might run away. We've agreed, 10 years. I rested my head against his strong chest, listening to his heartbeat. The heartbeat never lies. 10 years later, on our wedding night, Herbert and I barely slept. The next morning, I went downstairs to dump the used little umbrellas while Herbert was still asleep, my face flushed with embarrassment. As soon as I stepped down, I saw Lucien. He was standing by his Ferrari, his chin covered in stubble, his eyes bloodshot, and cigarette butts scattered all over the ground. I didn't know how many cigarettes he'd smoked. He glanced at the transparent trash bag in my hand, then turned his face away, not wanting to look. His voice was hoarse beyond belief. Rose, I waited all night, watching the lights go off in your room. All the pride had drained from him. His gaze avoided the trash bag, but it couldn't avoid the red marks on my neck. The once proud young master, now staring at my neck like he had lost something precious, his eyes reddening. His voice cracked with desperation. Rose, I'm sick. I feel terrible. In the past, when he said that, I would drop everything to take care of him. I would cook for him, peel apples, feed him medicine, take his temperature. But now, all I could say was, buy some medicine and take it. Lucien staggered a little, his eyes reddening even more. Lucien's family was wealthy, and to protect him from kidnapping, they had trained him in martial arts since he was a child. He was tough, used to pain, and proud of it. But now, one tear fell from his eye, and he didn't even wipe it away, just staring at me. Rose, actually, when I saw you smile at Herbert, I thought about a lot of things. I could treat you like that too. He closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, as if struggling to say something difficult. Even if I'm a stand-in. Isn't a stand-in allowed to be promoted? Rose, I can't accept you being with someone else. I was a little speechless, and I shook my right hand. On my finger was a wedding ring. The diamond wasn't big, but I had carefully designed and custom-made it. Lucien's face turned even paler. Rose, take it off. Will you take it off, or should I help you? He pleaded hoarsely, if you want a ring, I'll buy you one, no matter the size. Just throw it away. Please, Rose. I shook my head. I can't. Lucien, this is my wedding ring. I looked down at it. Herbert gave it to me. I love it. Lucien choked up. Don't say that, Rose. It's really hurting me. I sighed. I didn't harbor any resentment toward Lucien, after all, it was that face that had helped me get through the hardest time in my life. I wanted Lucien to let go of the past and look forward. I was considering how to comfort him, but when I looked up, I was surprised to see someone. Marina had arrived. She, who was always so elegant and beautiful, now had a terribly bad complexion. She looked at me in disbelief, then at Lucien. Lucien, I didn't believe what others told me, but now I see it. You broke up with me in the middle of the night, booked a flight to go back to your country, all this for her? She glanced at my wedding ring, as if insulted. She's so plain-looking, and she's married. You broke up with me for her? Marina looked furious. In the past, when Marina said something like this, Lucien would cross half the world to chase after her. But now, he didn't even look at her. He just spoke to me, as if she didn't exist. Rose, I can't live without you, really. I haven't slept in days. He looked utterly haggard. Will you come back, Rose? Baby, I'll change. I'll change everything. I won't look at another woman again. His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. The stand-in can be promoted to the real thing, and we can get married and even divorce. I'll really change, I swear. Please, I'm begging you. I opened my mouth, stunned, but couldn't find the words. I had never seen Lucien like this before. Never. The proud young master, who had never begged Marina even after years of awkwardness between them, was now pleading with me like this. Marina was also frozen. Her face alternated between red and pale, and finally, she threw out, "Don't regret it. I won't give you a second chance," before turning and running off, crying. Lucien didn't even look back. I reminded him, "Marina's really gone." But Lucien reached out to grab me. "I never planned to stay with her. She was just an obsession. When it comes to marriage, there's only you in my mind, no one else." Lucien. I rubbed my temples, cutting him off. I was worried Herbert might wake up and find me missing, so I decided it was time to speak openly. "Actually, I never really saw you as a stand-in. I did care about you, once. How could I not? 6 years of constant closeness, sharing skin and intimacy. How could I not have fallen for him?" Lucien's eyes brightened. I sighed. "But you pushed me away, Lucien. Don't you remember? You always chose Marina whenever I started to feel something for you." I gave a bitter smile. "It was you who pushed me away. You kept reminding me that Herbert would never treat me like this, that I could never replace Herbert." The light in Lucien's eyes dimmed. He still struggled, though. "I can change, Rose. I really can." I shook my head, cutting him off. "Lucien, you don't love me. You just can't accept that someone doesn't love you. It was Marina before, and now it's me." I pointed to my chest. "But I can't keep entangling myself with you. My heart now belongs to my husband. There's no place for you here anymore." The last flicker of light in Lucien's eyes vanished. I didn't say another word. I just walked past him and went home. When I reached the door, I was surprised to find Herbert standing there, as if he had been waiting for me. I wasn't sure how long he had been awake. I panicked. "Did you hear everything?" Herbert pulled me into his arms, soothing me. "Don't worry." He patted my back. "Lucien called me. He told me everything and asked me to let you go to him." "What did you say?" I asked, stunned. "I told him I would take you back, but I also doubled the money I promised for your treatment and gave him a wedding invitation on top of that." "Wait, what?" I couldn't find the words to respond. I couldn't even begin to imagine how Lucien had found our wedding hotel. Herbert, he understood how to kill someone's spirit. I don't know when Lucien left. And frankly, I didn't have the time to care. I was too busy preparing for my honeymoon with Herbert. On a beautiful afternoon, we arrived at a quiet island for our honeymoon. The sky was blue, the sea was turquoise, and the golden sand stretched out beneath a gentle breeze. Herbert and I lay in the sun, eyes squinted, content to bask in the warmth until evening, when we returned to our wooden cabin by the sea. I had told Lucien years ago that I wanted to stay in a cabin like this, but never had the time. After hearing me mention it, Herbert immediately booked the place and brought me here for our honeymoon. I stood by the window, hoping to see the ocean at night, but as I looked out, I saw a familiar figure sitting on the beach next door, drinking beer. Lucien, all alone, surrounded by empty bottles. I pursed my lips, closed the window, and before I could draw the curtain, Herbert came over, hugging me and kissing me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lucien's lonely figure on the beach, drinking away, while Herbert led me to the bedroom. The next morning, I woke up for a drink of water and was startled to see Lucien still on the beach, unmoving. I rushed out, crouching beside him to check for signs of life. Thank God, he was breathing. I sighed in relief, about to leave when Lucien suddenly grabbed my wrist and opened his eyes. Once proud and confident, his eyes now looked blurry with alcohol, filled with sadness and helplessness, staring at me in the soft morning sunlight. In a hoarse voice, he pleaded, "Rose, can I hold you just once more? Just one last time. Please." I shook my head, pulling my hand away as I stood up. "I'm married now, Lucien." Lucien, deeply intoxicated, half sobbed, half laughed. His voice mingled with the sound of the rising waves. "But I won't let you go, Rose. It's not that I can't have you. It's that I loved you without even realizing it. Rose, baby, give me one more chance. I swear I'll cherish you for the rest of my life. I froze, then turned around and walked back. This kind of entanglement couldn't continue. I needed to put an end to it. I walked back, and Lucien seemed to think there was hope. He looked up at me with eager anticipation. I lowered my head, took out my phone, and silently held it up in front of his eyes. It was a photo of a pregnancy test, 2 lines. "I'm pregnant, Lucien." Lucien froze. After a few seconds, he violently pushed my phone away, as though it were a poisonous snake, refusing to even glance at it. Not a single word escaped his lips. I stood up, looking down at him, and returned the words he had once said when we broke up, word for word. "We've come to an end." With that, I turned and walked back to the cabin. Behind me, there was only silence. Later, I completely forgot about Lucien. Herbert and I were living a busy and joyful life, and I had almost completely forgotten about the past. 10 months later, I got pregnant and gave birth to a daughter. At the baby's 100-day banquet, Herbert was proudly showing off our daughter, grinning from ear to ear. I sat off to the side, watching Herbert with our daughter, and felt warmth spread through my heart. A server from the banquet hall ran over and handed me a delicate gift box. "Excuse me, ma'am, this was just delivered by a gentleman who asked me to give it to you." Thinking it might be a gift from one of Herbert's friends for the baby's 100-day celebration, I thanked the server and took the box. I opened it to see what was inside. Inside were 2 items. One was a gold pendant, shining brightly. The other was a huge pigeon egg-sized ring. The ring looked very familiar to me. Nellie leaned over to take a look and exclaimed, "Isn't this the ring Lucien gave you when you got married? He asked me to give it to you. Do you want me to return it to him?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. After a moment, I snapped out of it and grabbed the gift box, rushing out after him, but I was still a step too late. I saw Lucien's tall, slender figure getting into his familiar sports car, and the engine roared as he drove off. Nellie followed me outside and sighed, "If he'd done this sooner, you two wouldn't have." I shook my head and smiled. "What are you talking about? There's no such thing as what if. What's missed is missed. There are no what ifs, and there's no going back." I returned to the banquet hall, looking at my husband and daughter, feeling even more grateful for them. Herbert came over, hugged me, and asked, "Is there something on my face? Why do you keep staring at me?" I shook my head and leaned into his embrace. "I'm just grateful I didn't miss out on you. I didn't miss out on my true happiness. And,